It was a brisk and dry afternoon in Los Angeles in the year 1971 when something extraordinary unfolded inside the walls of Studio 8B. Outside the sun blazed over the city, but inside the studio the atmosphere was electric with tension and expectation. Harold Jennings stood in front of the makeup mirror, adjusting his tie with the kind of precision only a man with 30 years of broadcast experience could muster. At 53, Harold was the network's top interviewer, known for his cutting British accent, his piercing gaze, and a gift for tearing down his guests with nothing more than well-placed questions and a curled smirk. He had interviewed presidents, diplomats, Nobel Prize winners, and intellectuals of every sort, and believed that this would be just another easy session. Bruce Lee, he scoffed, would be no different. Just another martial arts sensation caught up in the whirlwind of Hollywood fame. To Harold, Bruce was a novelty, not a thinker, not a philosopher, just a man with fast hands, a good jawline, and the fortune of knowing how to fly kick across a film set. The very idea that this so-called kung fu actor could provide meaningful conversation was laughable to him. The only reason Harold had agreed to the interview was because the network insisted. Bruce's popularity was climbing and audiences were fascinated by him. Harold saw it as a temporary spectacle, one he would shut down with a few sharp jabs and some sarcasm. A young assistant director named Melanie, barely out of film school, stood nervously behind the camera, her clipboard trembling slightly in her grasp. She watched Bruce stretch a few feet away in silence. He was calm, precise, deliberate in his every move. Dressed in a modest gray suit and black loafers, Bruce didn't look like the explosive martial artist the public had seen in films. He looked like a philosopher, or perhaps a scholar. Melanie whispered to the cameraman Joe that Bruce had trained big stars like Steve McQueen and James Coburn. Joe shrugged and replied that Harold thought Bruce was just a stuntman with good PR. 10 minutes before going live, Harold strolled over with his trademark arrogance. He looked Bruce over and made a smirking remark about breaking the studio furniture if the questions got too deep. Bruce simply smiled and replied that he preferred conversation over confrontation. That response drew a light laugh from Harold, who clearly thought this would be easy. Melanie leaned toward Bruce and warned him not to take Harold seriously. He just liked to provoke people. Bruce turned and said something that made her pause. "I'm not a bear. I'm water." Melanie didn't understand fully, but the way he said it made her feel something powerful had just been said. Then the red light turned on. The live broadcast began. "Welcome to Evening Reflections," Harold announced with the flair of a showman. "Tonight we sit down with martial arts sensation Bruce Lee." Applause filled the small studio as Bruce stepped onto the carpet, bowed to the audience, and took his seat across from Harold. The moment he sat down, Harold leaned in with a subtle grin. He wasted no time. He asked Bruce whether he had anything to offer beyond high kicks and shirtless scenes. Bruce responded with grace. Martial arts, he explained, was not about fighting others but mastering the limitations within oneself. His tone was even, his posture relaxed. The audience began to shift their weight, leaning forward, sensing that this was not the easy target Harold expected. Harold tried to mock him again, comparing his art to choreography. Bruce answered that movement was not about looking good but about expressing something true. That it was not just performance but a deep form of survival. The tension built in the room, but Bruce remained calm like a still lake. Harold brought up the famous quote about being like water and mocked it as something fit for a fortune cookie. But Bruce looked him in the eye and explained it with depth. Water adapts. It becomes whatever it is poured into. It is humble but powerful. It can wear down the hardest stone. The room fell silent. Even Harold was taken aback by the poetry and clarity of the metaphor. He tried to regain control by saying Bruce was too philosophical for someone known to punch through walls. But Bruce stayed calm and replied that most people only see the punch. They do not see the years of quiet discipline behind it. Melanie backstage was now writing furiously in her notepad, underlining Bruce's quotes as if she were witnessing a masterclass. Harold tried again, saying martial arts was still violence at its core. Bruce disagreed firmly. Violence, he said, is misused power. Martial arts teaches restraint and awareness over impulse and ego. It was clear now that Harold's plan to dominate the conversation was crumbling. His jabs were being answered with thoughtful precision. Bruce was not defensive. He was grounded. Harold then accused him of dressing up violence in philosophical clothes to sell movies. Bruce leaned back and said if he wanted to sell violence, he'd sell gloves, not quote ancient philosophers. The crowd laughed. For the first time, Harold was visibly shaken. Sweating slightly under the lights, he changed tactics. He asked Bruce if he knew anything about Western philosophy. Quoting Descartes and Kant, he tried to stump Bruce. But Bruce replied calmly and accurately, even expanding on Kant's definition of enlightenment. He then added that the real danger is when intellect becomes arrogance, when someone knows just enough to believe they have figured out the world. Harold was stunned. He didn't expect this martial artist to quote philosophy and psychology like a scholar. Bruce revealed that he had studied psychology at the University of Washington, spent time in libraries, and kept notebooks of his thoughts. That detail surprised even Melanie. She had done Bruce's prep sheet and none of this was there. It was a hidden depth. One that shifted the entire energy in the room. Harold desperately tried to find footing. He brought up science, asking if Bruce had anything to say about physics. Bruce answered instantly. Newton said that objects in motion stay in motion. That's every punch I throw. But Newton also said every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That's why I train my mind as much as my body. So I respond, not react. Then Bruce leaned in and said something that settled over the room like a hush. Martial arts is the science of the body. Philosophy is the language of the mind. I am just translating between them. The silence was not awkward. It was sacred. Even the crew had stopped working and were simply watching. Joe nudged Melanie and whispered that this was more than an interview. It was a masterclass in handling aggression without returning it. Bruce's voice grew softer now. He shared that he had been born in San Francisco, raised in Hong Kong, and returned to a country that did not know what to make of him. Not white enough to be the hero. Not foreign enough to be the villain. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact. Delivered not with bitterness but with clarity. And in that moment the man sitting across from Harold Jennings was no longer just a martial artist or actor. He was something else entirely. A bridge between worlds. A force of nature. Like water. I lived in between, so I made my own way. The room stayed still as if time itself leaned in to listen. Bruce spoke not from bitterness but from a place of raw, unfiltered truth. I started teaching martial arts to people of all backgrounds, black, white, Asian, Latino, because the body does not know color, only rhythm, pain and growth. Harold sat a little straighter. There was nothing left for him to counter, no clever argument, no smug retort. This was not theory. This was lived truth. I read once, Bruce continued, that the goal of education is not to fill a bucket but to light a fire. Martial arts did that for me. It taught me how to think, not what to think. The words didn't just land, they carried weight. They resonated. They burned gently into the air. Harold paused, recognizing the line. John Dewey, he said slowly, a quote often passed around in academic circles. Did you just quote Dewey? Bruce nodded casually, as if referencing a weather forecast. I like his thoughts on experiential learning. That's how I train. You can't teach someone to feel a punch in a textbook. Harold let out a soft exhale that might have once been a laugh. But this time it was laced with disbelief. The crew around them stood frozen in quiet awe as Bruce gently explained his philosophy, not as a set of rules but as a living, breathing system. I created Jeet Kune Do not as a style but as a philosophy. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, and add what is uniquely your own. Harold blinked slowly and muttered, you make martial arts sound like jazz. Bruce smiled. Exactly. Structured freedom. That moment paused like a held note. Harold stared at him. That's genius. That word genius hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. You memorize that quote? Harold asked, half joking, hoping it was borrowed so he could relax into familiarity. Bruce shook his head. No. I wrote it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was sacred. It was like the whole studio took a collective breath and chose not to exhale. Harold's hands trembled slightly over his notes. That cracked something in him. A thin, fragile piece of armor that had held for decades. For the first time in his long career, he didn't know what to say. The control room behind the glass stood in silent awe. Not a single cue was whispered. Not a single finger moved. Just that moment. You wrote that, Harold repeated softer, now more like a child than a journalist. Bruce nodded slowly. I wrote it after watching a student struggle with balance. He kept trying to copy others. So I told him, absorb what is useful, discard what is not, and add what is uniquely your own. Harold swallowed. That very quote had been handed to him in a pamphlet by a colleague just weeks earlier. He had laughed at it, then dismissing it as Eastern poetry for the spiritually bored. And now it sat before him, no longer abstract but alive. Breathing. Real. I think Harold said that most people see your body before they hear your mind. That's why I speak softly, Bruce replied, so they have to really listen. A silence followed, but this one felt earned. Not empty. Full of gravity. The audience sat still until someone in the back slowly began to clap. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was reverent. Others joined, not for spectacle but for truth. Harold tapped his pen against the desk, but this time it was not arrogance, it was reflection. He reached for one final index card almost on instinct. He hadn't planned to use it. But now it felt necessary. You once said, Harold read, that to know oneself is to study oneself in action with another person.
What does that mean?
Bruce's eyes did not shift. It means you don't find yourself sitting alone in silence. You find it in conflict, in love, in conversation. We are revealed through connection. And right now Harold asked, what's being revealed?
Bruce smiled. Just enough.
That truth is rarely loud, and humility is often mistaken for weakness.
And there it was.
The moment Harold Jennings finally understood. This was no performer, no exotic starlet packaged for Western curiosity. Bruce Lee was a genius.
A bridge. A mirror.
And he had nearly missed it. Not because Bruce hit it, but because Harold had not looked. The interview did not end with music or a flashy outro. It ended with a bow. Bruce stood first, bowed gently to Harold and then to the audience. Harold stood too. It was unscripted, unprecedented.
He bowed back. Not for the camera. For the man.
The red live light dimmed and the spell broke, but no one in that room would ever be quite the same. Bruce walked backstage, quietly collecting his jacket, while Melanie still clutched her scribbled notepad, her hand frozen. That was something else, she whispered, unable to find the right words. Bruce gave a gentle smile. No need to thank me. Moments later Harold appeared from behind the curtain. He was still holding the last cue card. It now felt like a toy. A game he no longer wanted to play. He caught Bruce before he left. Mr. Lee, he said. His voice had none of its familiar edge. May I say something?
Bruce turned.
I came today ready to tear down a myth, Harold admitted. But you didn't build a myth. You built a bridge. Between strength and thought, between east and west, between body and mind. Bruce didn't gloat.
He just smiled. Then I did my job.
I underestimated you, Harold added. I'm used to that, Bruce replied. But now you don't have to.
They shook hands.
And that night Harold Jennings did something he had not done in over a decade.
He rewrote his column. 3 times.
The original headline was going to be Hollywood's Muscleman Tries to Get Deep.
Sort of.
Instead he titled it Arrogant Journalist Tries to Humiliate Bruce Lee. Ends up meeting a genius. The piece went viral.
Letters flooded in. Teachers. Students. Martial artists.
Academics. People who had never watched a Bruce Lee film but were now quoting his words. Reading his philosophy. Sharing the interview. Months later Bruce would pass.
Far too soon.
But his words remained.
Echoing.
Through classrooms, gyms, hearts, and generations.
And Harold.
He kept a recording of that interview on tape. When asked about his most difficult guest, he never said a word. He would just press play. Years later on his deathbed, Harold told his grandson one last thing. Remember the name Bruce Lee. He taught me more in 1 hour than most men do in a lifetime. And somewhere between motion and silence, between instinct and intellect, Bruce's voice still whispers through time. Be water, my friend. Thank you for watching this video.